I thought I'd share with you some commentary I saw from Douglas McGregor on the US proxy war in Ukraine, and I thought it was very interesting, very concise, and kind of gives an idea of the future of that war, that being that I think the gloves will be coming off in November, and it's going to be very, very bloody for Ukraine, even more so than it has been for Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers, but mostly Ukraine. So, and this is why, of course, diplomacy is so important, but you're not going to see that from the US because they helped sort of create that war through an existential threat to Russia, and they sabotaged the peace talks between Ukraine and Russia in April, and they continue to fund the war. There is absolutely no inclination by US empire to stop this, and as the saying goes, they will fight to the last Ukrainian. This country is going to be totally destroyed at this point, and they're just either funding, or there's Polish troops pretending to be Ukrainians. There's NATO. There's tens of thousands in the past of troops in Ukraine that have been trained by NATO. There's all kinds of people involved in this now, and it's the intention is to destroy Russia and overthrow it, and then balkanize it. It's disgusting, and that's of course what they want to do to China next. And of course, Biden has just sent another package to Taiwan. They're going to fight China to the last Taiwanese person, to the last Australian. That's the idea that the Australian government doesn't seem to grasp, or thinks that we have an ally in the US. So anyway, this is going to be, I have a feeling that in the next 2 or 3 months, everything is probably going to come to a close, because Russia has decided that it's had enough of the messing about by the US via the Ukrainian army. Basically they're fighting NATO at this point, and they've had enough, and so they weren't fully all in. It was a special military operation, and now I think it's just going to be, they're going to start just carrying out a full-on sort of invasion to sort of, I suppose, bring an end to it. That's sort of my feeling. I'm a complete amateur. I haven't been following everything about this war, because I can't follow it, all of it. But this is the gist of what I'm seeing that's happening now, and I think this Colonel McGregor gives a very good synopsis of it. And I was just going to make a few comments while I play some of his commentary. And then he was a Pentagon advisor. He's been, a foreign policy analyst for a long time. He's a combat veteran, and so he's very interesting. And Professor Jeffrey Sachs, he's also has very good commentary. And I was going to also show an excerpt from when he was on Democracy Now! No, I'm not endorsing Democracy Now!, by the way, and I'm not necessarily endorsing everything that Colonel McGregor says in any of his other interviews, and he was in the Trump administration. But anyway, he actually seems to have a fairly honest appraisal of things, and it's always good to get that, because sometimes one can get bogged down in a lot of things that are going on, and it's good to actually get an overview of what's happening with Ukraine and Russia. And hence I haven't really talked about it much at all, except in a very generalized way, because I don't know anything about wars like this. And I don't really, it's very hard to know what is real and what is not. There's so much propaganda, and it seems like the US, a lot of people have just completely bought into all the corporate media propaganda, which is cheering on, a nuclear war, and thinking that the US can win it. I mean, how sort of sad is that? On top of that, Russia never threatened to engage in some sort of preemptive nuclear strike on anybody. That is their last sort of resort if they are attacked and they think that they're going to be destroyed. For some reason, the corporate media has managed to convince everybody that Putin's speech said that it had indicated they were going to do something preemptive. So this is where, it all goes terribly I mean, this, truth is the first casualty of war, and the propaganda, the media, the fourth estate is just a U.S. national security state propaganda arm at this point. There's a terrible rumor now that just like the terrible rumor that was put out about Libya, where before they completely destroyed Libya, and there were all those lies. This is the Obama administration. They put out this lie that that Libyan sort of soldiers were taking Viagra so they could rape the population. And this is what they're doing now in relation to Russia, saying Russian soldiers are now taking Viagra so that they can rape Ukrainians. I mean, it's just appalling. It really does your head in. I can't focus very much on all this propaganda because it does my head in to see the lies upon lies upon lies, the propaganda, and how dangerous it all is. How we could all end up in a mushroom cloud because they end up pushing the situation so badly, and people and those in the Pentagon and unhinged people in the administration, both sides of the party, etc., in the US, that they could think that they could actually win a nuclear war. I mean, I could see, I've said before that it's a case of how desperately the US wants to maintain full spectrum dominance in a world where they're actually losing, they're failing as an empire. They're overstretched and in collapse as capitalism, end stage capitalism is happening. Fascism starts appearing more and more, and the only way they can maintain their power and their economic power in particular is to continue to invade countries one after another. And so, it's Russia and then China. And so, this can end very, very badly if they decide, well, it's either we have full spectrum dominance or we blow the world up. I mean, it really depends on how unhinged people are, or they could be just helping their corporate buddies, which they are already lining up how to, slice up Ukraine and sort of use it, to privatize everything and install their corporations, as they do in every country that they invade, or do a coup d'etat to overthrow whoever's in there. This is sort of, Ukraine is already being sort of prepared for its sort of takeover by US corporations, they think. And, it really depends on how much they want to give to their corporate buddies, and how long they want to drag it out so corporations can fill their pockets. So this is really, which one is it? It's probably all of the above. Anyway, I'll share this by Colonel McGregor and then Jeffrey Sachs. I think they're both interesting. Hope you're all well and trying to look after yourself, your mental health, because this is not good, what's going on. And on and on and on, and it's not going to get any better in 2024 when most likely the Republicans get into office. And it depends who's in office and who might gain from making friends with Russia, although they have to appease the CIA. And we know what happens if you decide you want to end some war. JFK, who was thinking about ending the Vietnam War. So anyway, that's what I want to say about that. And I'll have a few little comments probably during this. During these different clips, and take care till next time. Bye for now.
I think it's a turning point of sorts, perhaps not quite what the Washington Post is suggesting, which I think may be something else. But let's talk a little bit about this conflict, which has evolved considerably over the last 7 months. Conflicts are not static. War is an ever-changing sea, if you will. And for the last 7 months, even though people in the West will never, ever admit it, the truth is that President Putin has exercised enormous restraint with regard to the use of his military power. We've never seen more than 20% of the Russian ground force in Ukraine. And most of the regular Russian ground force was subsequently withdrawn after the first 4 months, during which the Ukrainian army that we built over several years was largely destroyed. What you have in Ukraine now is a mix of various volunteer organizations, militias, some allied forces like the Chechens, Kuban Cossack volunteer organizations. They've turned out to be very good fighters, plus the Wagner mercenary group. It's also turned out to be very effective on the ground. But the real Russian army, with its combat forces, has largely pulled out of the fight. I thought they would come back in August, but apparently the decision was made not to do that. And what's happened now, I think, in the Kremlin is that Mr. Putin and his advisors have all concluded there's no chance of negotiating an end to this conflict. I think he really clung to that hope, even in the middle of April, when it was clear that we in London would not permit Zelensky and Kyiv to make any sort of a compromise, to accept neutrality, for instance, off the table. So now we're dealing with a different Russia. And what you saw yesterday in 3 waves were 202 missiles and loitering munitions attacking specific targets all over Ukraine. This is something that they've always been able to do. They have the precision-guided munitions and missiles, just as we do. This time, they not only hit so-called critical infrastructure, they also hit the secret police headquarters of the Ukrainian state, which is a notorious organization engaged in murdering people and forcing people into enemy gunfire at gunpoint, recruiting at gunpoint. But they also hit a number of analyst cells, places where people are putting together intelligence pictures. In other words, they've signaled that there's nothing happening in Western Ukraine that Moscow doesn't know about. And they've also signaled there's nothing over there they can't reach and destroy. So I think we're seeing a glimpse of what's going to happen later on this fall, which I predict will be major offensives on the ground once the soil freezes. That's coming. And this will be much closer to what a lot of us thought would happen at the very beginning. Massive offensives designed to utterly annihilate what remains of the Ukrainian armed forces.
The Western media is trying to paint these Russian...
President Biden apparently felt compelled to call, or at least his handlers felt compelled to have President Biden call Mr. Zelensky, reassure him that we will continue to supply him, that we back him, there will be no change. And at the same time, Mr. Zelensky pleaded with more air defense systems because the Russian attacks also destroyed 80% of Ukrainian air defenses. So if someone is suggesting this was not consequential, we have to look at those developments and we rapidly conclude, no, that's wrong. Mr. Zelensky is in a panic, unquestionably. They've got serious logistical problems moving things around in the country. Suddenly, Russia has decided enough is enough. We're not going to exercise the restraint we have in the past. Well, keep in mind that the so-called HIMARS system, which is this high mobility rocket system, is largely manned by so-called contractors.
Right.
Presumably, that consists of Americans in civilian clothes working on contract for the Ukrainian government via some other mechanism that we've created. Could also be Europeans. But these systems take a long time to learn how to operate, let alone maintain. Now, something called NASAMS, which is a surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missile system designed to protect point targets with a very complex radar system, it's one of the best in the world, was in Kyiv, and it's being destroyed. And the way you overwhelm point air defense systems is that you launch lots of missiles and rockets. And eventually you're going to overwhelm any system, regardless of how good it is. That's what the Russians did in this operation. They targeted air defense sites and overwhelmed them. So, yes, Mr. Zelensky wants more of these, but then he's also got to have contractors operate them because his soldiers are not trained to do it. Well, the people engaged in direct fire combat on the ground are Ukrainians. Now, there are reports of large numbers of Polish soldiers in Ukrainian uniform making up for losses that occurred over the last few months. Because, as you point out, most of Ukrainians' best forces are gone. They've been killed or wounded. Ukrainians have lost roughly 100,000 dead, perhaps 2, 3, even 400,000 wounded.
Wow.
They started out with an army of 600,000. Remember, we spent 8 years building this army up with the express purpose of attacking Russia. That's what it was designed to do. That's why the Russians attacked it. And ultimately, we wanted to put missiles into eastern Ukraine with which we could threaten Russia. So again, eastern Ukraine had to be neutralized, and that's why the Russians intervened. But the Russians, as I pointed out earlier, have always exercised great restraint because, first of all, this is another Slavic country, another Orthodox Christian Slavic country. They're not interested in killing large numbers of people. They didn't want to destroy a lot of infrastructure. The areas where Russian forces are sitting in southern and eastern Ukraine were already Russian. They simply wanted to guarantee equal rights for the Russians in Ukraine with other Ukrainian citizens. That was the point of the Minsk agreements, which were never honored. So the bottom line is, at this point, you're looking at cannon fodder. People without much training being rounded up, put into uniform, handed an AK-47, put behind machine guns, whatever else, put into tanks and armored fighting vehicles. Do they get training? Some have had good training, but the vast majority haven't had much. So the casualties have been very high. But once you move above the tactical level and you move up to what we would call division or corps levels, you find NATO staffs are actually running the show. In other words, people from France, Great Britain, the United States, other countries are doing the systematic planning and setting forth proposals for what should happen next.
Right.
There's a lot of evidence that the Ukrainian president has not taken our advice very well, and he's determined to attack, largely because I think he sees himself in a position where he has everything to lose and not much more to gain. So he thinks he can wear down the Russians. The problem is, for every one Russian killed or wounded, you have 5, 6, or 7 Ukrainians being killed or wounded. So for the Russians, they've economized. They've run a fairly cheap, inexpensive defense, while the Ukrainians have run very expensive offenses. So now Ukraine is in a very serious crisis. It may not survive, particularly when this major offensive begins in November, December timeframe and the ground is frozen. I don't know what the Ukrainians will do, because then they will face the regular Russian army, large numbers of Russian army troops, not just volunteers and allied units, but the Russian army. And it will have the operational freedom to do what many Russians wanted to do at the beginning, which is anything that we suspect is dangerous or threatening to us can be targeted and destroyed. So it'll be a very different war that's coming. Let's be frank, I'm not on distribution from the Russian General Staff. But when I look at the arrival of Russian forces in the theater, and they're arriving in groups of 50,000 spread around Ukraine in various places. They're doing a lot of training and preparation right now. They will then move to axes, operational axes of advance, something we expected to see at the beginning of the war that we did not see. And then they will strike very hard and very deep. And whatever is still in front of Russian forces in Ukraine will be annihilated. That will be their mission: destroy them, annihilate them. Now, where will the Russians stop? I suspect they'll stop at the Dnieper River. They've never been interested in crossing that. They don't want to go into what is historically Ukraine, which is west of the river. That's where the Ukrainians live. They're not Russified. They are real Ukrainians. He doesn't want to go over there. But he's going to take Odessa. He's going to take Kharkov. These cities will be taken once and for all as a result of these offenses. And then there's not a great deal we can do, anybody in the West, unless they want to go to war with Russia. I see no appetite anywhere in Europe for anyone to go to war with Russia, with a possible exception of the Poles. And even there, the consensus supporting war against Russia is cracking, slowly but surely. In the United States, no one's even interested. Everybody's talking about the hurricane that struck Florida. No one really cares what happens in Ukraine. That's why we've gotten away with so many bad policy decisions, because Americans didn't pay attention. Well, they're not really paying much attention now, but they're beginning to see that perhaps everything they were told about this is wrong. Well, that's anybody's guess. I couldn't even begin to conjecture what would happen to Zelensky. He could be removed by his own people. He could simply get onto an aircraft and fly to one of his mansions in Miami or Venice or somewhere else that have been provided to him. I have no idea. But as far as the Russians are concerned, Odessa has always been a Russian city. It was never part of Ukraine. The same thing is true for Kharkov. These were Russian cities from the very, very beginning, and they were Russian speaking. Now, that doesn't mean Ukrainians haven't moved in there, and they have in many cases. In Odessa, for instance, almost 50% of the population now consists of Ukrainians, because they pushed a lot of Russians out.
Right.
But from the vantage point of Moscow at this stage, they're not going to tolerate that nonsense any longer. They're going to take these places. But they're going to do it as the Russians always do things, very methodically, very deliberately. And this new commander who's just been named is a very able person. He has a great reputation. He did good work in Syria for the Russians. And he is a tough-minded individual. He's now going to have forces, and he's going to have capabilities at his disposal that his predecessors have never had. That's why I think the Washington Post suggested this is a turning point. They're right. It is. It may not be what they think, but it's a turning point. I can only tell you that Belarusia has a population of perhaps 8 million. So it's, even though its landmass is large, its population is small. Its army has not modernized over the last several decades, and the Russians are now trying to hastily modernize it, provided new equipment, new communications equipment, perhaps even new tactical organization. That will not happen overnight. What I think we're talking about now is the Russians coming in, integrating with the Belarusians, and they speak the same language. There's no longer any great distinction between so-called White Russia and Great Russia. There was, but certainly not since the Second World War. And I think they'll be more concerned about defending the border against any interest that Poland may have in attacking them. Because remember, Minsk is a city that was historically in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So it's this notion of a white Russia. It was further east. So you've got all of these historical interests at play. And this is the final point that I need to make. We have no role in this. This is not part of our world. And the only interest we have in this place is in bringing peace to it. Right. We should be working to end this thing, not make it worse. Because if we try to make it worse, it will spread and engulf others for the reasons I just outlined. There are many people, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, they all have agendas that involve territory, populations. And that's not our agenda. We don't want to be involved in that. We just want them to get through this with minimal loss of life and get back to business. And if you're going to argue, well, the Russian army is too small and too incompetent to threaten anyone, but on the other hand, that Mr. Putin harbors the ambition to conquer Europe and invade NATO, you can't have them both ways.
Right.
So the point is, no, there's no interest in attacking NATO, and there's no interest in a war with NATO. We should recognize that and find as quickly as possible a solution that people can live with. It won't be as good as it would have been several months ago. Ukraine is going to look at the loss of territory, but this has happened repeatedly over 1,000 years in Europe. This is nothing new. You have to make peace, and that will include some changes that some people may not like.
He served as advisor to 3 UN secretaries general. His latest article is headlined, "The West's False Narrative About Russia and China." He begins the article by writing, quote, "The world is on the edge of nuclear catastrophe in no small part because of the failure of Western political leaders to be forthright about the causes of the escalating global conflicts. The relentless Western narrative that the West is noble while Russia and China are evil is simple-minded and extraordinarily dangerous," Jeffrey Sachs writes.
The main point, Amy, is that we are not using diplomacy. We are using weaponry. This sale now announced to Taiwan that you've been discussing this morning is just another case in point. This does not make Taiwan safer. This does not make the world safer. It certainly doesn't make the United States safer. This goes back a long way. I think it's useful to start 30 years ago. The Soviet Union ended, and some American leaders got it into their head that there was now what they called the unipolar world, that the U.S. was the sole superpower and we could run the show. The results have been disastrous. We have had now 3 decades of militarization of American foreign policy. A new database that Tufts is maintaining has just shown that there have been more than 100 military interventions by the United States since 1991. It's really unbelievable. And I have seen in my own experience over the last 30 years, working extensively in Russia, in Central Europe, in China, and in other parts of the world, how the U.S. approach is a military first and often a military only approach. We arm who we want. We call for NATO enlargement no matter what other countries say may be harmful to their security interests. We brush aside anyone else's security interests. And when they complain, we ship more armaments to our allies in that region. We go to war when we want, where we want, whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq, or the covert war against Assad in Syria, which is even today not properly understood by the American people, or the war in Libya. And we say, we're peace-loving. What's wrong with Russia and China? They are so warlike. They're out to undermine the world. And we end up in terrible confrontations. The war in Ukraine, just to finish the introductory view, could have been avoided and should have been avoided through diplomacy. What President Putin of Russia was saying for years was, do not expand NATO into the Black Sea, not to Ukraine, much less to Georgia, which if people look on the map, straight across to the eastern edge of the Black Sea. Russia said, this will surround us, this will jeopardize our security, let us have diplomacy. The United States rejected all diplomacy. I tried to contact the White House at the end of 2021. In fact, I did contact the White House and said, there will be war unless the U.S. enters diplomatic talks with President Putin over this question of NATO enlargement. I was told the U.S. will never do that. That is off the table. And it was off the table. Now we have a war that's extraordinarily dangerous, and we are taking exactly the same tactics in East Asia that led to the war in Ukraine. We're organizing alliances, building up weaponry, trash talking China, having Speaker Pelosi fly to Taiwan when the Chinese government said, please lower the temperature, lower the tensions. We say, no, we do what we want, and now send more arms. This is a recipe for yet another war. And to my mind, it's terrifying. We are at the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, which I've studied all my life, and I've written a book about the aftermath. We are driving to the precipice, and we are filled with our enthusiasm as we do so, and it's just unaccountably dangerous and wrong-headed, the whole approach of U.S. foreign policy, and it's bipartisan.
You mentioned, for instance, that the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, represent more than 40% of the world's population and have a greater GDP than the G7 nations, yet their interests and their concerns are pretty much dismissed, or in the case, obviously, of Russia and China, portrayed to the American people as the aggressors, as the authoritarians, as the ones that are creating turmoil in the world. I'm wondering if you could expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. And directing us to that is extremely important. The disproportionate power of the Western world, and especially the Anglo-Saxon world, which started with the British Empire and now the United States, is about 250 years old, so a short period in world history. It happened for a lot of very interesting reasons that the Industrial Revolution came to England first. The steam engine was invented there. That's probably the single most important invention of modern history. Britain became militarily dominant in the 19th century, like the United States was in the second half of the 20th century. Britain ran the show. Britain had the empire on which the sun never set. And the West, meaning the United States and Western Europe, now meaning the US and the European Union, the UK, Canada, Japan, in other words, the G7, the European Union, together, is a small part of the world population, perhaps now roughly 10%, a little bit more, maybe 12.5% if you add in Japan, to Western Europe and the US. But the mindset is we run the world. And that was the way it was for 200 years in this industrial age. But times have changed. And really, since the 1950s, the rest of the world, when it gained independence from European imperialism, started to educate its populations, started to adopt and adapt and innovate technologies. And lo and behold, a small sliver of the world really didn't run the world or didn't have a monopoly on wisdom or knowledge or science or technology. And this is wonderful. The knowledge and possibility of decent lives is spreading throughout the whole world. But in the United States, there's a resentment to this, a deep resentment. I think there's also a tremendous historical ignorance because I think a lot of U.S. leaders have no clue as to modern history, but they resent China's rise. That is an affront to the United States. How dare China rise? This is our world. This is our century. And so starting around 2014, I saw step by step, I watched it with intense detail because it's my daily activity, how the United States recast China, not as a country that was recovering from a century and a half of great difficulty, but rather as an enemy. And we consciously as a matter of American foreign policy, started to say we need to contain China. China's rise is no longer in our interest, as if the United States is to determine whether China is prosperous or not. The Chinese are not naive. In fact, they're extraordinarily sophisticated. They watched all of this exactly the same way that I did. I know the authors of the U.S. texts. They are my colleagues at Harvard or other places. I was shocked when this kind of containment idea started to be applied. But the basic point is the West has led the world for a brief period, 250 years, but feel that's our right. This is a Western world. We are the G7. We get to determine who writes the rules of the game. Indeed, Obama, a good guy on the spectrum of what we have in foreign policy, said, let's write the rules of trade for Asia, but not have China write any of those rules. The U.S. will write the rules. This is an incredibly naive and dangerous and outmoded way to understand the world. We in the United States are 4.2% of the world's population. We do not run the world. We are not world leader. We are a country of 4.2% of the people in a big, diverse world, and we should learn to get along, play in the sandbox peacefully, not demand that we have all the toys in the sandbox. And we're not over that thinking yet. And unfortunately, it's both political parties. It's what motivates Speaker Pelosi to go to Taiwan in the middle of all of this, as if she really had to go to stir up the tensions. But it's the mindset that the U.S. is in charge.
You recall, I'm sure, the enormous financial collapse that occurred in Mexico in the 1990s, where the Clinton administration authorized $50 billion in a bailout to Mexico, which was really to Wall Street investors. At the time, you were advising the post-Soviet Russian government, which also had had deep financial problems at the time, but was unable to get any significant Western assistance, or even from the International Monetary Fund. And you were critical of that at the time. I'm wondering if you could talk about the differences, how the U.S. responded to the Mexico crisis versus the Russian financial crisis, and what the roots of that may have been in what the current situation is in Russia today.
Absolutely. And I had a controlled experiment, because I was economic advisor both to Poland and to the Soviet Union in the last year of President Gorbachev, and to President Yeltsin in the first 2 years of Russian independence, 1992-93. My job was finance, to actually help Russia find a way to address, as you described it, a massive financial crisis. And my basic recommendation in Poland and then in Soviet Union and in Russia was to avoid a societal crisis and a geopolitical crisis. The rich Western world should help to tamp down this extraordinary financial crisis that was taking place with the breakdown of the former Soviet Union. Well, interestingly, in the case of Poland, I made a series of very specific recommendations, and they were all accepted by the U.S. government, creating a stabilization fund, canceling part of Poland's debts, allowing many financial maneuvers to get Poland out of the difficulty. And, I patted myself on the back. Oh, look at this. I make a recommendation. And one of them, for $1 billion stabilization fund, was accepted within 8 hours by the White House. So I thought, pretty good. Then came the analogous appeal on behalf of first Gorbachev in the final days, and then President Yeltsin. Everything I recommended, which was on the same basis of economic dynamics, was rejected flat out by the White House. I didn't understand it, I have to tell you, at the time. I said, but it worked in Poland. And they'd stare at me blankly. In fact, an acting Secretary of State in 1992 said, Professor Sachs, it doesn't even matter whether I agree with you or not. It's not going to happen. And it took me actually quite a while to understand the underlying geopolitics. Those were exactly the days of Cheney and Wolfowitz and Rumsfeld and what became the project for the new American century, meaning for the continuation of American hegemony. I didn't see it at the moment because I was thinking as an economist how to help overcome a financial crisis, but the unipolar politics was taking shape, and it was devastating. Of course, it left Russia in a massive financial crisis that led to a lot of instability that had its own implications for years to come. But even more than that, what these people were planning early on, despite explicit promises to Gorbachev and Yeltsin, was the expansion of NATO. And Clinton started the expansion of NATO with the three countries of Central Europe, Poland, Hungary, and Czech Republic. And then George W. Bush Jr. added 7 countries, Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, and the 3 Baltic states, but right up against Russia. And then in 2008, the coup de grace, which was the U.S. insistence over the private opposition of the European leaders. And European leaders talked to me privately about it at the time. But in 2008, Bush said, NATO will expand to Ukraine and to Georgia. And again, if you take out a map and look at the Black Sea, the explicit goal was to surround Russia in the Black Sea. By the way, it's an old playbook. It's the same playbook as Palmerston in 1853 to 1856 in the First Crimean War. Surround Russia in the Black Sea, cut off its ability to have a military presence and to project any kind of influence into the Eastern Mediterranean. Brzezinski himself said in 1997 that Ukraine would be the geographic pivot for Eurasia. So what these neocons were doing in the early 1990s was building the U.S. unipolar world. And they were already contemplating lots of wars in order to take out the former Soviet allied countries, wars to overthrow Saddam, wars to overthrow Assad, wars to overthrow Gaddafi. Those were all rolled out in the next 20 years. They've been a complete disaster, debacle for those countries, horrible for the United States, trillions of dollars wasted. But it was a plan. And that neoconservative plan is in its heyday right now on 2 fronts, in the Ukraine front and on the Taiwan Straits front. And it's extraordinarily dangerous what these people are doing to American foreign policy, which hardly is a policy of democracy. It's a policy of a small group that has the idea that a unipolar world and U.S. hegemony is the way that we need to go. I think what is important to say is that there is no linear determinism, even from events like that, which were destabilizing and very unhappy and unnecessary, to what is happening now. Because when President Putin came in, he was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. What he saw, though, was the incredible arrogance of the United States, the expansion of NATO, the wars in Iraq, the covert war in Syria, the war in Libya against the UN resolution. So we created so much of what we're facing right now through our own ineptitude and arrogance. There was no linear determination. It was step-by-step U.S. arrogance that has helped to bring us to where we are today.